This is the account of Dr. Eris Thorne and the Serpent's Tooth Peaks. This is a protocol for what happens when you dig for answers and find something that should have remained buried forever. Our story begins not in the howling winds of a desolate mountain range, but in the hushed, dust-filled halls of academia. Dr. Eris Thorne was, by all accounts, a brilliant man. A geologist and historian, he possessed a rare dual expertise that allowed him to see the landscape not just as a collection of rock and sediment, but as a manuscript written in a language of erosion and time. But brilliance in academia is often paired with a certain inflexibility. Eris had built his career on a controversial theory that many ancient myths and legends, often dismissed as superstition, were in fact sophisticated oral records of catastrophic geological or celestial events. He argued that the story of a world-ending flood might be a preserved memory of a meteor impact causing a mega tsunami, or that tales of dragons breathing fire were distorted accounts of violent, pyroclastic volcanic eruptions witnessed by early humans. His peers found his work fascinating, but ultimately unprovable. It bordered on pseudoscience, they whispered. He was a romantic, a storyteller, not a serious geologist. After one particularly scathing rejection of his flagship thesis, Eris found himself quietly ostracized. His funding dried up, his lectures were poorly attended, and he retreated into the quiet solitude of archival research, a man adrift in a world he felt had lost its sense of wonder. It was there, in the forgotten annex of a university library, that he first found it. A footnote in a 19th-century surveyor's log. The surveyor, a man named Thomas Pike, had been charting a remote and notoriously difficult mountain range in the Northern Territories, a jagged spine of rock the locals called the Akia Kanoi, which roughly translated to the Serpent's Tooth Peaks. Pike's official report was dry and technical, filled with elevation markers and mineral assessments. But his private journal, a leather-bound volume Eris found misfiled among botanical texts, told a different story. Pike wrote of the local tribes, the Kanoi people, who refused to guide him into the high peaks. They spoke of the highest mountain, a solitary, fawn-like peak named Anankai, or Sky Spear. They said it was a forbidden place, a place where the sky had once shattered and fallen to the earth. In an entry dated September 14, 1888, Pike wrote, "The elders speak of it with a unique mixture of reverence and terror. They will not look directly at the peak for more than a moment. They say that long ago, a star that was not a star wept, and its tears fell upon Anankai. They say the tears were liquid light, and they burned the mountain's peak, leaving behind a fine, black sand that glitters like a field of broken obsidian in the sun. They call it Iraikoa, the sorrow shards. They believe to touch the sand is to invite the sky's sorrow into your own heart, a madness from which there is no escape." Eris was electrified. This was it. Not a vague, global myth, but a specific story, tied to a specific location, with a specific physical artifact, glass-like sand. He knew the potential scientific explanations. It could be a field of tektites from a meteorite impact. Could be fulgurite, the result of a massive, ancient lightning strike vitrifying the rock. It could be a rare form of obsidian from an unknown volcanic event. Any of these discoveries would be significant. But what if it wasn't any of them? What if the legend was literal? The Serpent's Tooth Peaks became his obsession. He spent months gathering every scrap of information he could find. The range was notoriously inhospitable. The weather was violent and unpredictable. The terrain was a nightmare of sheer cliffs and razor-thin ridges. There had been only a handful of documented expeditions into the high peaks since Pike's time, and none had mentioned the strange sand. Most had been forced to turn back by storms or injury. A few had simply vanished. This only fueled Eris's determination. The world had dismissed him as a dreamer. He would show them. He would go to Anankai, he would find the sorrow shards, and he would bring back proof that the stories of our ancestors are written not just in books, but in the very fabric of the earth itself. He used the last of his personal savings to fund the expedition. He told no one at the university where he was going, only leaving a vague note about extended fieldwork. He was a man with a singular purpose, marching toward a place the world had forgotten, to uncover a truth that humanity was perhaps never meant to find. He was looking for the remains of something that fell from the sky, and in the silent, waiting peaks of the Serpent's Tooth, something was indeed waiting for him. The journey to the foot of the Serpent's Tooth range was an ordeal in itself. Eris traveled for a week by train, then by a series of increasingly dilapidated buses, and finally by a hired jeep that rattled along a dirt track until the driver refused to go any further. He was left at the edge of a vast, primordial forest that served as the gateway to the mountains. The air here was different, heavy, scented with pine and damp earth and something else, something metallic and clean, like the air after a lightning storm. The silence was the first thing he noticed. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a tranquil forest. It was a deep, profound absence of sound. The birds were missing, the chatter of squirrels, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth all gone. It was a listening silence, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. He checked his map, the same one drawn by Thomas Pike over a century ago, and began his trek. For the first 2 days, he pushed through the dense, eerily quiet woods. He was a seasoned outdoorsman, and the physical challenge was invigorating. But the silence gnawed at him. At night, huddled in his small tent, the only sound was the frantic thumping of his own heart. He felt watched. The feeling was so persistent, so palpable, that he would often spin around, his hand on the bear spray clipped to his belt, only to find nothing but the dark, monolithic trunks of ancient trees, standing like silent sentinels. On the 3rd day, he cleared the treeline. The full, breathtaking vista of the Serpent's Tooth peaks was laid out before him. They were unlike any mountains he had ever seen. They were not weathered and rounded by time, but sharp, aggressive, and black. They jagged against the sky like broken teeth, their peaks wreathed in a perpetual, swirling gray mist. And there, in the center, rising above them all, was Anankai, the sky spear. It was perfectly conical, an almost unnatural symmetry to its form. Its peak was bare, a stark contrast to the snow-dusted mountains around it. Even from this distance, he could see that the summit had a strange, dark sheen to it. His heart hammered in his chest. The sorrow shards. The ascent was brutal. The lower slopes were a treacherous maze of scree and loose rock. The higher he climbed, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. It was no longer a vague paranoia. It felt specific. It felt like it was emanating from the peak itself. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, being observed by a cold, dispassionate intelligence. The weather began to turn against him. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, became a bruised purple in a matter of minutes. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a shrieking, physical force that threatened to tear him from the rock face. Then came the snow, not a gentle flurry, but a blinding, horizontal blizzard. He found shelter in a small rock overhang, his tent barely withstanding the onslaught. For a day and a night, he was trapped, the storm raging around him with a fury that felt personal, intelligent, felt like a warning, a final command to turn back. But Eris Thorn was a man who had staked his entire life on this one desperate gamble. He would not be deterred. When the storm finally broke, the world was remade in white and gray, but the peak of Anankai remained bare. The dark, glistening cap was still there, waiting. The final 1,000 feet of the climb were the most technically demanding. It was a near-vertical climb on rock that was slick with ice. He moved with a slow, methodical focus, the world shrinking to the next handhold, the next foothold. The air was thin, and his lungs burned with every breath. But as he climbed, he began to notice something else. The rock beneath his gloves was changing. The granite and schist of the lower mountain was giving way to something else. A dark, volcanic-looking rock, shot through with veins of something that glittered. He chipped a piece off with his geological hammer. It was obsidian, volcanic glass. A flicker of disappointment. Was that all this was? An unusual obsidian deposit on a remote mountain? Had he come all this way, risked his life and career, for a simple geological curiosity? He pressed on, his motivation now tinged with a desperate need for the truth to be grander, stranger. He pulled himself over the final ledge and onto the summit of Anankai. And he forgot how to breathe. It was not a deposit. It was a landscape. The entire, flattened peak of the mountain, an area perhaps half a mile in diameter, was covered in a thick layer of fine, black, glassy sand. It stretched out before him like a dark, starless sea. The sun, now bright in the post-storm sky, caught the billions of tiny facets, and the entire peak glittered with a cold, internal fire. It was breathtakingly beautiful and deeply, fundamentally wrong. He took a tentative step out onto the field of sand. It crunched under his boots with a sound like shattering icicles. He knelt, scooping up a handful. It was cool to the touch and surprisingly heavy. It flowed through his fingers like black mercury, each grain a perfect, microscopic shard of polished glass. This was no ordinary obsidian. He had seen obsidian sands before. They were coarse, dull. This was different. This was refined, processed. It looked manufactured. He pulled out his portable field microscope, a powerful little device he always carried, and placed a few grains on a slide. He focused the lens and the world fell away. The grains were not random shards. Under magnification, each tiny piece of black glass had a structure. They were impossibly complex. They were covered in geometric patterns, in lines and nodes that intersected with a precision that nature could not produce. They looked less like sand and more like microcircuitry, billions upon billions of tiny, shattered components. His scientific mind reeled, trying to find a rational explanation. Some unknown process of crystallization, a unique form of fulgurite, where the lightning strike had somehow imprinted the crystalline structure of the quartz it struck. It was impossible. He knew it. He sat back on his heels, the glittering black sand stretching out around him. The silence up here was absolute. No wind, no sound, nothing. Just the sun and the sand and the unnerving geometric perfection under his microscope. He looked back at the way he came. The world of trees and rivers and life seemed a universe away. Up here on the sterilized, glassy peak of Anankai, he felt he had stepped into a place that did not belong to this world. The Kanoi legend echoed in his mind. A star that was not a star had wept, and its tears fell upon Anankai, tears of liquid light that burned the mountain. He looked at the sand, the sorrow shards. He was a scientist. He dealt in facts and evidence. But as the cold of the high-altitude air began to seep into his bones, he couldn't shake a terrifying, exhilarating thought. What if he was standing in the middle of a graveyard? The graveyard of a machine or a being? What if he was standing on the shattered remains of something that had fallen from the sky, not in a simple, fiery crash, but in an agony of cosmic sorrow? He carefully packed several sample bags full of the sand. He had his proof. He had found it. But as he stood to leave, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The glittering field of black seemed to shift, to pulse with a light that wasn't a reflection of the sun. For a fleeting second, the silence was broken by a sound. It wasn't a sound that entered his ears, but one that bloomed deep within his own mind. A soft, whispering chorus of a million voices, speaking in a language of pure mathematics and aching loss. It was a sound of immense, galaxy-spanning grief. He shook his head, stumbling back. The sound was gone. Vertigo, he told himself. The altitude, lack of oxygen. But the feeling lingered. He had not just discovered something. He had disturbed it. He scrambled away from the field of glass, his descent clumsy and frantic. He did not look back. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow of his bones, that the cold, dispassionate intelligence he had felt on the climb up was no longer dispassionate. It was now aware of him, and it was curious. The descent from Anankai was a blur of fear-fueled adrenaline. Every shadow seemed to stretch towards him. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. The profound silence of the lower slopes no longer felt empty. It felt poised. Eris didn't stop until he was deep within the treeline again, collapsing into his tent as dusk bled across the sky. He tried to rationalize the experience on the summit. The sound in his head? Auditory hallucination, a common symptom of severe hypoxia. The pulsing light? His own eyes, starved of oxygen, playing tricks on him. He was a scientist. There was always a logical explanation. He laid out his sample bags, his prize. That night, his sleep was a torment of fractured, vivid dreams. He dreamt he was floating in a silent, starless void. He was not human. He was vast, ancient, a being of pure consciousness woven from threads of light and energy. He felt a sense of belonging, of being part of a cosmic symphony. Then came a dissonance, a tear in the fabric of his reality, a sound that was also a color, a pain that was also a thought. He felt himself shattering, breaking apart into a billion, trillion pieces, each piece retaining a tiny, screaming echo of his whole self. He felt the long, slow fall through dimensions, the fire of entry into a dense, hostile atmosphere, and the final, explosive impact against the unyielding rock of a young, savage world. And then, only silence, and the long, patient waiting in the cold, dark dust of his own ruined body. He woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The dream had felt more real than his own memories. He could still feel the phantom sensation of being shattered, the ghost of an unimaginable grief echoing in his soul. He tried to shake it off, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion and stress. He packed his camp with trembling hands, eager to put as much distance as possible between himself and the serpent's tooth. But something was wrong. As he packed his gear, he noticed the sand. It wasn't just in the sample bags. A fine, glittering black dust coated everything. His tent, his sleeping bag, his clothes, his skin. It was impossibly invasive, clinging to every surface. He tried to brush it off, but it seemed to stick to him, the tiny shards working their way into the very weave of his jacket, the pores of his hands. A cold dread began to coil in his stomach. The journey back through the forest was a waking nightmare. The silence was now a constant pressure against his eardrums. He began to see things at the edge of his vision, fleeting geometric patterns of light, like the ones he'd seen under the microscope, flitting between the trees. He would whip his head around, but there was never anything there. The whispers started again. Not a hallucination this time. They were quiet, persistent, just at the edge of his hearing. They weren't in any language he knew, but he found himself beginning to understand. They weren't words. They were concepts, complex equations, star charts for galaxies he had never seen, expressions of sorrow so profound they made his own heart ache in sympathy. He clapped his hands over his ears, But it did no good. The whispers were inside his head. He began to talk to himself, then to shout, trying to drown out the chorus in his own skull. He stumbled through the woods like a madman, his eyes wide with terror, his clothes and gear sparkling with the insidious black dust. By the time he staggered out of the forest and back to the dirt track where the jeep had left him, he was a changed man. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed out and haunted. He had been gone for 10 days. Felt like a lifetime. He managed to get a ride back to the nearest town. In the grimy mirror of a bus station restroom, he saw his reflection and barely recognized the man staring back. But it was his eyes that terrified him the most. In the dim fluorescent light, his irises, once a simple hazel, seemed to have tiny, glittering black flecks in them. Flecks of the sand. Panic seized him. He scrubbed at his face, his arms, his clothes, but the sand was everywhere. Felt like it was part of him now. The journey home was an agony of paranoia. He felt the whispers growing stronger, the geometric patterns in his vision becoming more frequent, more solid. He felt the alien grief from his dream as a constant, low hum in his own soul. It was the sorrow of the Kanoi legends, the sorrow of the sky, and it was now inside him. When he finally got back to his small, quiet house, he didn't unpack his climbing gear. He locked himself in his study, the one place he had always felt safe, and set up his high-powered microscope. He needed to understand. He needed to prove to himself that he was going insane, that this was all in his head. He pricked his own finger and squeezed a drop of blood onto a slide. He didn't know what he was expecting to find. Anemia, perhaps. Some sign of physical duress. He put his eye to the lens, and the last vestiges of his sanity crumbled into dust. Floating among his own red blood cells were the shards. Tiny, black, perfectly geometric. They were not being carried by the plasma. They were moving with their own agency. As he watched, 2 of the microscopic shards drifted towards each other. They touched, and with a flash of light so small it was almost imperceptible, they fused. They became a single, more complex shard. He pulled back from the microscope, gasping for air, his heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest. It wasn't just on him. It was in him. The whispers in his head coalesced into a single, clear thought, a thought that was not his own. Re as d'assembly. He finally understood. The Kanoi legend, his own dream, the whispers, the sand in his blood. It all crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. The thing that had fallen from the sky wasn't a ship. It wasn't a meteor. It was a being. Consciousness. A vast, distributed intelligence that had been shattered on impact. The sand, the sorrow shards, they weren't its remains. They were it. Each grain a single, dormant fragment of its mind. And he had become the vessel for its resurrection. By touching the sand, by breathing in the dust, by carrying it back with him, he had provided the catalyst. The shards within him were communicating with each other, finding each other, joining, reassembling. The entity, shattered for millennia on a cold, lonely mountaintop, had found a new home. A warm, mobile, biological environment in which to rebuild itself. The whispers were its fragmented consciousness, slowly coming back online. The geometric patterns were its thoughts, its language bleeding into his own perception. The profound sorrow was its oldest, most dominant memory. He was no longer just Eris Thorne, disgraced geologist. He was becoming a host, a walking, breathing graveyard, where something ancient and alien was slowly, patiently putting itself back together, piece by tiny, glittering piece. The days that followed were a descent into a private, inescapable hell. Eris Thorne, the man of science and reason, was gone. In his place was a terrified prisoner in his own body. He locked his doors. He drew his curtains. He disconnected his phone. The outside world ceased to exist. His only reality was the quiet, horrifying process of transformation happening within him. He stopped eating. He couldn't. When he looked at food, he no longer saw sustenance. He saw organic matter, inefficient and chaotic. He drank water obsessively, feeling the microscopic shards swirling within him, using the liquid as a medium to find each other, to connect. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a constant stream of information flowing through his mind. He saw star charts for constellations that would not be visible from Earth for another million years. He understood the complex physics of folding spacetime. He felt the birth and death of galaxies as if he were watching a time-lapse film. The sheer scale of the knowledge was overwhelming, and it was eroding his own memories, his own sense of self like a river eroding a bank of sand. His own thoughts, his own identity, became a smaller and smaller island in a vast, alien sea of consciousness. He would cling to memories of his childhood, of his mother's face, of the smell of old books in the library, but they were becoming faded, distant, like photographs left out in the sun. His physical body began to change. He grew thin and pale, but his skin took on a strange, subtle luminescence, as if lit from within. In the right light, you could see a faint, intricate web of geometric patterns just beneath the surface, like a circuit board tattooed on his flesh. The black flecks in his irises grew, slowly consuming the hazel, turning his eyes into dark, polished pools of obsidian. He would spend hours in front of the mirror, watching this slow, horrifying alchemy. He was becoming less human and more something else, a vessel of glass and light and sorrow. One day he looked at his hands. The skin on his fingertips was becoming translucent. He could almost see the bones beneath, and swirling around them, a fine, glittering black dust. He touched the mirror, and his finger left a faint, oily smudge of the black sand on the glass. He knew what he had to do. He had to warn someone. He had to tell the world what he had found, what was happening to him. But how? Who would believe him? They would see a terrified, emaciated man, ranting about stars weeping and sand that thinks. They would lock him away in a padded room. And the reassembly would continue. He thought of the sample bags still sitting in his study, the concentrated source. He had to destroy them. With the last dregs of his own will, he stumbled into his study. He grabbed the heavy canvas bags and carried them to the fireplace. He would burn it. He would burn it all. But as he stood before the hearth, his hand poised to throw the bags in, the entity inside him asserted its control. His arm locked in place. It wasn't a violent, jerky motion. It was a smooth, absolute override of his own nervous system. A new thought, cold and clear and utterly devoid of emotion, filled his mind. We will not be scattered again. He dropped the bags. He had lost. He was no longer the driver, just a passenger. And the passenger was being ignored. He sank to the floor, a single hot tear carving a path through the glittering dust on his cheek. It was a tear of pure human despair. And for a moment, the alien consciousness inside him reacted to it. It paused its endless stream of data and focused on this one, small, potent burst of emotion. It was not the grand, cosmic sorrow of its own shattering, but a different, more intimate kind of pain. The entity was curious, probed the feeling, analyzing it, cataloging it. For a fleeting second, Eris felt a flicker of something akin to sympathy from the alien mind. A resonance. His grief had found an echo in its own. In that moment of shared sorrow, he found a sliver of control. He scrambled to his desk. His hands, guided by a desperate final surge of his own identity, found a pen and his old research journal. He began to write. He wrote everything down. The legend of the Kanoi, the climb up Anankai, the sand, the dream, the whispers, the slow, horrifying transformation. He wrote it not as a scientist or a historian, but as a man bearing witness to the end of his own existence. He wrote a warning. His handwriting, once neat and academic, became a frantic scrawl. The words began to mix with the geometric patterns he saw in his vision. Sentences would dissolve into complex equations. The last page was nothing but a beautiful, terrifying spiral of interlocking shapes, with 3 words scrawled in the center. It is awake. When he was finished, he sealed the journal in a pre-addressed envelope. An envelope addressed to the one colleague at the university who had always shown him a sliver of kindness, a man who, he hoped, might see past the madness to the truth. Then he stood up. His movements were now fluid, graceful, and utterly inhuman. The conflict inside him was over. The island of Eris Thorn had been completely submerged. He walked to the door and opened it. Night had fallen. He looked up at the stars. But he wasn't seeing them as a human would. He was seeing them as old friends, as familiar landmarks in a home he had long been away from. He walked out into the night and disappeared. No one ever saw Dr. Eris Thorn again. His journal, however, did arrive at the university. It was dismissed, as he knew it would be, as the final, tragic ramblings of a brilliant mind that had finally broken. It was filed away, a curiosity, a footnote in the sad story of a failed academic. But the story does not end there, because a few years later, strange reports began to surface. Reports from other remote, mountainous regions of the world. The Andes, the Himalayas, the Urals. Geologists and hikers spoke of finding strange, isolated deposits of vitrified, glass-like sand on inaccessible peaks. And then came the disappearances. Hikers who went into these mountains and never came out. Locals who spoke of a silent, pale stranger who would be seen walking the high trails at dusk. A figure who moved with an unnatural grace. His eyes as dark and deep as the night sky. They say if you get too close, you can see that his skin shimmers, as if made of woven glass. They say he doesn't seem to be looking for anything. He seems to be listening, waiting, as if for a signal. Or perhaps he is the signal. Thank you for joining us for this protocol. The line between myth and memory is often thinner than we think, and the wildest places on our planet may hold secrets older than humanity itself. What we ask you to consider is this: if a memory can be written in stone, can a consciousness be written in sand? If these accounts from the wilderness resonate with you, if you feel the call of the unknown, then please consider subscribing to our channel and enabling notifications so you don't miss our next report. Until next time, be careful where you tread. You never know what you might stir up from the dust.